And we are live streaming. Hi.
Hey, Nicola, how are you?
So we did a few videos before, like last year, before the strange time at the normal trade show, and a couple times before also. So can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Paul Gray. I'm Senior Research Manager at Omdia, which is part of Informa Technology.
And you just published like some report on actually during this strange time, there's a lot of people watching TV and buying new TVs and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, who would have thought at the beginning of the year that such an event would cause, well, along with obviously the economic hardship and the changes in people's lifestyles, but also amazingly enough, it's led to a record Q3 in the TV industry. So record shipments of TVs in this quarter for a Q3. And I don't think anybody really expected that. And it's one of those things that, of course, consumers are completely rational. They don't do strange things as an overall group. And really what's happened is that, of course, television and viewing and entertainment at home has become much, much more valuable to people than it was last year. You can't go out. The alternatives to spending your money on are much lower. And so as a result, people are investing in TVs and investing much more in home entertainment.
And people are, I guess, watching more TV than ever, and watching more YouTube than ever, watching more Netflix than ever. All the views are going up. People are doing their patriotic duty to sit on the couch and watch a lot of stuff all day, right?
Yeah, I mean, who'd have thought that watching TV was good for you? We've always been told it was bad for us, and now we're told that being a couch potato is a good thing. But it is really quite incredible, and just shows that it's kind of an ill wind that blows no good at all. And certainly out of this, then we do see big patterns changing in the way that consumers are entertaining themselves, and unsurprisingly, that they've got to find other things to do with their spare time. And so, yeah, watching TV is one of them. Also, of course, the other thing that's happened is that many people have been forced to work from home, and we've seen investment by consumers and enterprises in many more notebook PCs and monitors. So that's also been a change. So the monitor business has really, really grown this year. And all of these things put more and more pressure on the display industry that's actually manufacturing the panels. That suddenly there's this surge in demand of big panels. And indeed, we see supply tightness. On the other hand, of course, mobile phones have not had such a happy year. A mobile phone is, quite apart from being a useful thing to have when you're away from home, and you're not going away from home so much. Of course, we all know that these things are personal jewelry. And what's the point in having the latest phone if there's nobody out there to see you having it? So
nobody's going outside anymore.
No, that's right. So indeed, the market for smartphones has gone down, but the market for big screens, for home entertainment and productivity at home has really gone up.
So can we see you have some slides that that are part of your publication, part of what you're publishing?
So let me just.
So it's just published recently, right?
Yeah, this is some background to what we've talked about and what we published. So a little bit on the on COVID-19, a bit on what's going on in the display industry, and then new technologies as well. So this is a very, very much a helicopter view of display growth by application. And what you can see already is that tablets and notebook PCs are up. The TVs at the moment, we're just having a row after in our forecasting team about what happens next. So Q3 was a record. It's the strongest quarter ever in the United States, which was still a bit of a surprise. A number of reasons for that. And one of the things that we're really wondering is how much longer this surge in consumer spending on technology products continues. But you can see that TV overall is going to depend on what happens in emerging markets. And And history shows us that in the developed world, TV demand is not really very linked to the economy. So when people want to cut back on their spending, they may not go out, they may not eat out, they may not go to the cinema, but TV is very cheap entertainment. By comparison to that, in developed countries, that developed country picture, in emerging countries, then people have less government support. They also find that a TV is a much greater expenditure as a percentage of their salary. And so it's a much bigger investment. And certainly we see spending on TVs does go down in emerging countries. And therefore, the balance between developed and emerging country demand is going to really swing whether the TV grows overall this year or not. So far, emerging countries are down on last year in total, and developed countries are up. And we'll see how that balance then plays out. And of course, a lot of that depends on what happens in the remainder of this year in terms of lockdowns and the development of the pandemic. So we'll wait and see what happens next.
So actually, those huge investments that happened quite a lot in China over the last 2-3 years with BOE, CSOT, are maybe actually paying off right now for them because they're getting to sell the capacity.
The capacity is incredibly tight at the moment. I don't think we've seen tightness like that in many years. And to give an example of what it's done on panel prices, then for TV panels, they've gone up by up to 60% this year. So 60% higher now than they were at the beginning of the year. And that's an incredible difference, especially in a business like TV where margins are really, really thin. This is a tough thing if you're a TV brand. Very, very tough. So the capacity is basically full at the moment. That everybody is trying to make absolutely everything they can, squeeze as much out. And that capacity is being demanded not just for TVs, but also for notebook PCs and monitors as well.
Because 1 year ago when we did the video, you were kind of saying that they might have invested too much and they might have too much capacity. Yep. And now it's actually matching the demand.
That was very much the case. Now, the other thing that changed was that the Koreans, so Samsung and LG, looked at that situation, concluded that there was really very little money to be made ever again in the LCD industry. And they initially signaled that they were going to get out of TV panel manufacture. And indeed, they then extended that to being out of all LCD by the end of next year. And so that is still basically what they're going to do. So that has brought that capacity back into alignment. Clearly, there's been a demand surge, but Samsung and LG still plan to cease LCD manufacture later on next year. They've brought it back a little bit later date, but we'll still expect that it will be pretty much, and I'll just show you this. In terms of display area, then it's pretty much a Chinese-only industry when you get to a few years in future in terms of area capacity. And that's really on the big bulk LCDs for TVs and monitors and so on.
So in China, they're pretty much, the way maybe to say it is that they're best at making something work that's more affordable?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're on the latest fabs with the very largest substrates. So if you imagine what a sheet of plywood looks like when you buy it from a timber merchant, so 3 meters by 2.5 meters, that's the sort of size of piece of glass that the garage door size that they're processing in those fabs. So incredibly efficient, optimized for larger sizes rather than smaller sizes, and so supporting size growth in the TV industry. But it was a hammer blow in terms of capacity. A year ago, it looked like excessive investment. If you look at it from a Chinese point of view, then you could say it was a way to take control of the industry. But the question was always how you were going to get a return on that investment. And what we see now is that the rest of the industry is moving towards specialisms. So into new technologies, into things that are hard to make, where people have much more added value, if you like. So if you think of it being like the semiconductor industry, then the Chinese making these big panels is rather like people making memory chips, whereas everybody else in terms of their display activities are going to be people who make application-specific specialist chips, if you like. So one's a commodity product still, and one's got a lot more technology and specialism in it.
Could it be maybe also maybe a mistake of that the Korean companies like Samsung, LG are divesting from making LCD themselves, or do you think is there a smart thing they did to just partner with the Chinese? That's what they're doing, right? To make it in China.
I think what you have to remember that there are different economic systems and different incentives on this one. It actually feels rather like 15 years ago or 20 years ago when the Koreans were investing in everything. Everybody said, how can they make money? They're over investing. And of course, that proved not to be the case. But I think it's this it's a cyclical trend in the industry. That the Chinese are investing in capacity that they're not so much at this early stage investing in specific technologies. That's beginning to change now. And the Koreans want to be in the bits where they can really make a difference and add value. So doing things that are technically hard, that are leading edge, solving problems that nobody knows a solution to yet, and developing the next generation of displays indeed.
So a lot of the world is hurting, right? A lot of different industries are hurting, but some are actually getting stronger in this thing. Yep. And the display definitely is one of them. That's big displays, TVs. That's the one that's where something is happening.
Right, absolutely. And you've got to be a little bit careful, because when you look at what's happened in terms of different industries, then clearly the auto industry and the home appliance industry, and indeed the mobile phone industry, which is the really big part of the display business, they've really suffered this year. So it's not a case that everybody has benefited from it. Probably we'll see some pent-up demand get released next year in terms of auto and mobile phones. But no, not everybody's benefited. So large displays have done well this year. Small displays, so say 10 inches and smaller, have really had a much tougher time. And you can see that in terms of shipments and revenues.
But there was a dip in the beginning of the year?
Yeah, that's right. So beginning of the year, of course, everybody got hit by lockdown measures. The supply chain got caught with unable to run fabs in China, or that the goods couldn't be moved. So there are a lot of immediate disruptions. What is incredible is how quickly the industry has got itself back on its feet and got going again. Now, there are still long-term consequences. So one of the ones, of course, was that, just to take a specific company example, LG's new OLED fab in Guangzhou in China, then the engineers had gone home to Korea over the Chinese New Year break. Then there were lockdowns and travel restrictions, and they couldn't get back to work. So they couldn't get back to China. So that commissioning was delayed. And of course, all the other equipment that was coming in and so on was disrupted. So there are still ripples coming out, but it's amazing how quickly the industry's come back to basic production. Yeah.
There's a lot more in this publication.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a few other things we can chat away through. In terms of technology, I think this is always an important point, that people get very fixated on new technologies, and of course they're important. But when you look at the area capacity, and we always think in terms of area, because you make the sheet of glass as a display and you can cut it up into lots of different things. And for example, you could make one 32-inch TV display, or that same piece of glass make 4 notebook PC displays, for example. But if you look in terms of area, and there is no mistake on this graph, you just can't see e-paper and QNED. LCD still grows in area over the forecast period, but OLED grows more. The question for OLED is that there's a massive amount of investment in OLED, and an assumption that everybody wanted an OLED phone, and everybody wants an OLED phone with a flex screen. And the overcapacity in the OLED side is, for small screen, is very, very high. So we're talking about something like something like 40%. Likewise in LCD. And we got an interesting push-pull happening there. So on the mobile phone side, of course, we got 5G happening, brand new silicon, expensive silicon, and the number of phones with OLED in them has actually gone back a little bit this year because an OLED display is much more expensive. And phone makers have to hit a price point, and to take cost out to pay for that 5G silicon, then they've actually swapped back to LCD. So it's not a done deal that if it goes to OLED, it never comes back. So still a lot of structural overcapacity in OLED. A lot will depend on the auto industry, how soon car makers move to OLED, or if indeed we discover that it's a problematic technology to survive in auto applications. But certainly for some OLED makers who've invested in hope, if they're underloaded, it's very hard to get a factory under control and highly productive. And we'll wait and see whether, all that OLED capacity will ever really be active in the industry, or whether there's signs of overinvestment there. And I think that small screen overinvestment looks to be more worrying. We'll probably again see a thinning out in due course.
And also in the large displays, LCD has been doing lots of developments, like we were talking about in the last year's video, where you are talking about this what's called 8K dual layer LCD technology, right?
Yeah.
Which BOE, Hisense, maybe some others you were mentioning also are getting into these dual layer LCD. I'm hoping there's been lots of developments over the last year. Do you have some info on that?
People have continued to work on it. I think, one of the things we've always discussed together is that there are many ways that you can continue to enhance LCD technology, and it's by no means a technological dead end or an evolutionary dead end. There are ways that you can enhance LCDs, and as I've always said to you, Nicolas, then you can make LCDs that look every bit as good as OLEDs. They're slightly different. They've got some advantages compared to OLEDs and some disadvantages, but you can make them look very similar. And one of them is by a lot of control on the backlight. Now, one way has been by dual cell. So you add in an extra switching layer just to control the backlight. The other way, of course, is you have a backlight with many more zones. So with mini LEDs, and you've seen Hisense go with the dual cell idea, and TCL pursuing the mini LED approach. Neither of them's really quite got there this year, and the reason is cost. These are expensive ways of doing things, and finding a way to break out of this cost to get real cost innovation, I think, is what is necessary. If, for example, on dual cell you look at it, then you've got this sandwich of more and more layers in the optical stack, and what people have discovered is that you need to bond the LCD for the backlight to the LCD for the pixel switching. And when you do that, you need to have a layer of transparent, let's call it glue, resin in between. And it's really difficult to do that without getting bubbles and imperfections. And that requires a lot of investment. So we're not quite there yet. We haven't got the cost breakthroughs. And that's going to be the question. This year, we saw a sort of end game beginning to appear that LCD prices had fallen very, very fast in 2019 and far away from OLED, which was on a different cost curve. And it's fair to say that LCDs were being sold at material cost because of competition. Now OLED's had a bit of a reprieve as LCD prices have come back up again. So I think we're still seeing this backwards and forwards between LCD and OLED and ways to enhance LCD.
And recently, looking out on YouTube, there's some talk of new investments that Samsung is doing in new technology. I think it's called quantum dot OLED. Is that right?
That's right. So one of the things about quantum dots is that they are an energy conversion material. So you can take blue light and you put it into the quantum dot, and out pops a photon of red or green. in fact, it's just energy, and they convert energy. So one of the other things you can do is you can put an electron into a quantum dot, and out pops light of red or green, or indeed you can make a special quantum dot for blue. So what they're doing at the moment in terms of the ideas is the first stage is that you have a layer of blue LEDs. The first one is using blue OLED LEDs. You then stick quantum dots on top, and it then converts that blue light into red or green, or of course it just shines directly through as blue. It's really conceptually rather like LG's solution, where they have white OLEDs and then they have a color filter which gives the color change. But the Samsung way converts the energy rather than just filters things out. So in theory, ought to be more efficient. In due course, that could be a bridging step where instead of having that light pumping the quantum dots, you pump it directly with electrons, and that's a true quantum dot display that's electrically driven. So you can see they've got quite a logical path on that one. The difficulty is that it has more layers in it than a current OLED. So it has everything to make the blue OLED, and then you've got to do the quantum dot layer. And you discover that these materials aren't compatible, so you have to put barrier layers in and things like that. So what starts off conceptually quite simple is actually rather more difficult to do in practice, but that's the idea. And I think, you know, some of the things that we've discussed over the years, that Samsung had a go at RGB OLEDs in TV. That they are, of course, the market leader in RGB OLEDs in phones, have more experience probably of that than anybody else. And they looked at RGB OLED in TV and said, no, this isn't something that's easily manufacturable or economic to make. And so they decided to go with this step using quantum dots instead.
What goes into the, how did LG manage to do it? And like they just have a different way of doing things, and they made the TVs, but now I think it was on Stop the FOMO, you know, this YouTube channel where I think he was talking about $11 billion has been Samsung is investing like such a huge amount of this QDO OLED. So, and it should be arriving so soon as like next year already.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how you do the maths as to exactly what's included in the investment. But let's make no mistake, this is a high stakes investment game on that. Yeah, absolutely. You know, so as we understand it, then sometime in 2021, then there will be some quantum dot based emissive displays that Samsung will launch. Samsung is being very cautious. They don't share much information, and why should they? So we'll expect it when we see it and look forward to it. But yeah, it will be a incredible technical achievement to do that.
Because one thing that I'm wondering is when I see those trade shows when BOE and CSOT and other companies are showing printed OLED, I'm wondering is maybe the Samsung, what they're doing, they're trying to make the whole thing printing, you know, like to make it more simple, to somehow cheaper to manufacture.
Yeah, I mean, I think the holy grail in the display industry has always been that you could roll-to-roll print displays, you know, rather like making newspapers or magazines, that you could print displays, because clearly it would transform the economics. And as I understand it, then there are some elements of inkjet printing that Samsung will use in that display manufacture. Exactly what I'm not so sure, but certainly there will be printing elements. And of course, you know, inkjet printing is another good way of processing things. One of the big advantages being that it's a cold process. So a lot of OLED processes at the moment are very hot processes, which means that, for example, producing a display on plastic to make it flexible or cheap is difficult because it won't withstand the heat, or you can only use very specific plastics. So certainly printing is, as we understand, very much part of that innovation step. So it's more than just making a display. It is really reinventing the process for making displays as well.
And this is something, the printing stuff will be OLED. It will not be LCD, right? The LCD is some different.
No, that's right. It's a printed
OLED
material. I've seen OLED materials in red and green that you can inkjet print. And I know that people have worked on blue as well. So it may be the parts of the OLED structure that is lighting the quantum dots, or it may be printing the dots themselves. But certainly there is a printing element in that.
One could imagine that the R&D, I don't know if you get access to those and get inside the R&D, secret R&D places at Samsung and CSOT and BOE. I can imagine they probably have some amazing printed OLED technology. Maybe they're just trying to get the yield, or what's called the life, to be good, right? Because if you buy a TV and it dies after a couple of years, that'll be a problem. So maybe they're just trying to get that fixed, and then they could get they're talking about $100 per meter diagonal, right? Like super cheap.
Well, we'll wait and see on that one. That certainly, I think, is a bit more of a science project, but very definitely, it's the way that you transform the economics is to print things rather than these sort of one-shot hot processes. And you're absolutely right that it's one thing to make something that works. It's something else to make one that is of a lifetime that people would expect and value. Yes, I think it's always an interesting question, which is if you had a display that only cost $50 and it lasted a year and was big, and you rolled it up and you got it posted to you or something like that, then replacing it would be like replacing a light bulb. Do you remember when you used to do that? Before we had LEDs, and I think that cheap but short life recyclable, I would sincerely hope, display could be another way of solving the problem. We'll wait and see. But I think, yes, the issue is always these things are very cruel, that it's relatively easy to get something that works. Getting something that is durable and robust is much, much harder.
And maybe you just add the quantum dot cartridge into that printer, right? And then you get the quantum dot.
Yeah, I'll have to go and ask I'll have to go and ask Canon or Hewlett Packard for that QD cartridge, and then you can do all sorts of wonderful things. Yeah, you can have quantum dot, documents, but it's certainly, these things, materials have to be handled extremely carefully. That quantum dots themselves need to be handled in very specific atmospheric and contaminant-free environments. And if, for example, you're just making a quantum dot film for a backlight, then like the Samsung QLED LCD TVs that we see at the moment, then you have to have resins and things like that to protect the dots, because these are very, very precisely manufactured components, in terms of the molecule level, and they can be poisoned. So you have to have things that are chemically inert to the dots.
And if you have this, let's say, printed 8K OLED on your wall, right? Hopefully the dead pixels are not going to be too destroying of the experience, right? Because you want to...
Right.
If that's the thing that start happening, you start having dead pixels and it disturbs your image.
That's exactly it. And of course, the other one is that it's even quite subtle things like we'll talk about burn-in and image retention. So any emissive display has burn-in. If you can put a pattern on it, then it'll wear one part out and the emission will drop. So, and the eye is very, very good at seeing that. Yeah, we are incredibly good at finding patterns in things, even where no patterns exist. Look up at the night sky and the stars, and you start seeing things there. So yeah, we're very, very good in it, and it's even tiny, tiny amounts that suddenly become unacceptable. So, the display industry is really tough. It's a tough, tough business. The human eye is very, very good at seeing imperfections.
Do you think Samsung has solved the whole burn-in in some kind of way with the QDO LED that might come out?
I think burn-in is inherent in any emissive display. That you can call it differential aging, and we will see. Clearly, they have to get it to an acceptable level, but any emissive display will burn in. CRT's burned in, plasma's burned in, OLED's burned in. The question is it at an acceptable level, and does it look unpleasant? I can't believe that Samsung will bring into production a fragile display.
Do you think that maybe they have found a way to increase the brightness?
That's the question, isn't it? Is exactly what sort of brightness it'll be, and of course, brightness is it trades off with life. And the problem with emissive displays is that all the energy that the display gives off as light has to come through the substrate in the display, be converted, and then shone out the front of the subpixel. Whereas the genius of LCD is that the switching bit and all that doesn't actually have to conduct much energy. It's just switching, and the light comes from somewhere else, from the backlight. So emissive displays are inherently much more difficult in terms of high resolutions and that energy transport into the substrate of the panel.
So on your slide, you were showing how one of the other slides you were talking about how China has and you expect it to be even so much huger part of the manufacturing, right?
Yeah.
How much micro LED is going to be out of China, or is that some stuff that who's gonna come out with these?
Okay, micro LEDs aren't actually in this one because you can't really think of them in terms of display area in the same way because it's not a substrate. So we haven't got micro LED in there on this one. I think the challenge for micro LED, and maybe I'll go forwards a few slides to this one. The challenge for micro LED is really about how you've got to assemble all these little tiny pixels onto a substrate, connect them up, as you say, not have any dead pixels, solve the uniformity problem so you don't get the tiling artifacts that we see at the moment. And of course, there's another way you can do it, which is you can assemble all those LEDs in one shot, which is what you do with an OLED display. So the manufacturing challenges are immense. They've still got all the other problems of emissive displays that you've got to get all that energy into the back of it, and heat management is a really big problem. So as a very crude rule of thumb, if you double the pixel density in an LED display, then the cost goes up somewhere between a factor of 5 and 10. You suddenly have more and more switching in one place. You have more electrical noise problems. You have more heat management, cooling problems, and indeed, even down to getting the black level back is difficult, because the black level is what it looks like when it's switched off, and a lot of the black level is a black layer between the LEDs. Put in smaller LEDs and closer together, you suddenly have less of the black bit, and it looks pale. So you actually have to have extra small LEDs for that. So these things don't scale well. And in the background, of course, is a display technology that's cheap and big and good enough, that works and is paid for, and that's LCD. And what history's taught us many times is that the best technology doesn't always win, and it's the technology that gives the purchaser what they want, and no more, no less. And the issue is with micro LED is getting from here to there. There are lots of people out there with mini LED displays at say 0.9 millimeter pitch for signage applications, architectural applications. But there isn't really anybody who has a crying need for those, who actually wants to go and spend for that resolution compared to, say, a 1.5 millimeter pitch display. It's good enough for most applications. If you've got a really, really big display, you don't need tiny pixels. So you don't need a 16K or a 32K display for that resolution. Pardon me. So I think a lot of it is a solution in search of a problem. And there are still formidable technical hurdles to be solved.
So what does this slide show? What is this? Is a snake?
Yeah, this is my display snake. So it's really from where we are at the moment in terms of new technologies. We've got OLED, and OLED's problem has always been that the good is the enemy of the best. You can make pretty impressive displays out of LCDs, and OLED is, if you like, an underdog technology. There's far less capacity, and how much extra will people pay for OLED over LCD? And you can see that already by region is very different. So OLED is a runaway success in Japan. And it's got a nice place for itself in Western Europe. In North America, consumers are a lot less keen on OLED. Why? Because they'd rather have a bigger TV instead. In Japan and Western Europe, 55 inches is a great TV size, very popular. In North America, it's a bit on the small side. And OLED has struggled up until now with 65 inch. I think we're beginning to see that change with the new LG fab. Then you can see this next enhancement for OLED, which is Samsung's QD OLED technology. It's less mature. It has more process steps than OLED, so potentially could cost more, certainly initially. And its question that it's got to solve is whether it can compete with OLED. Then we move on to even more perhaps futuristic technologies. Totally different one is MicroLED. It's not an organic technology, so it's silicon and gallium nitride. So being inorganic, then potentially the molecules are less fragile. So burn-in and things like that and heat are potentially less of a problem. But instead, you've got a different problem, which is just taking these LEDs and how do you manufacture them into a display? How do you transfer thousands of them at one go and things like that? And at the same time, you've got to solve the cost. There is another micro-LED technology out there, which is a slightly different solution, which is you do it all on a single chip on a very small display. And that's the near-eye one. So for VR headsets or AR glasses and things like that, then I think that one has immediate applicability. In terms of technology, it's actually much less of a step because we've been making lots of things on silicon for a very long time. So I think we could see near eye get mature quite quickly. Different problem, which is about the end application. We've also got mini LED.
With that small micro LED, I did a video with JBD out of Hong Kong, China, and there's another in the UK. I think it's part of Apple now or something like that, or I forgot somebody.
The Plessy activity, I should think, probably micro. Yeah.
And they were talking about huge amount of nits, like they even talk about million nits or something like that. How do they get so much brightness through a little thing like that?
Right. In that case, it's the advantage of being very small, and you can do it through the thickness of the silicon. And of course, it's a very, very small area. But yeah, you can do some quite incredible things, which on the macro scale look almost impossible. I think somebody told me that inside an Intel PC chip, then the energy density in that chip is comparable to that of the inside of the sun. So it's those sort of things are possible on that small scale in chips, and getting the heat out of it is relatively seems to be relatively easier than, say, a big display. But very definitely the rules are rather different at that micro scale, and you can do some quite impressive things. And I've certainly seen some micro LED displays for things like camera viewfinders that look really, really impressive. Really, really impressive. And that's even just looking at it on a tabletop running. You still, say a 0.7 inch display, and they're really incredible.
Because on my JBD video, they have all these like eye protection things because it gets so bright, it gets dangerous, like on the table.
Right.
Like so bright. So the thing I'm wondering is what they could just put like a lens in front, and then you have maybe out of those small printed, not printed, but fabbed micro LEDs, you might be able to project the 4K or 8K on the wall.
That maybe not quite onto the wall. I think the energy densities are still a bit high for that, which is why you have DLP, which is again like LCD. You change the switching medium from the light emission medium, but very definitely you could do some interesting things where it's probably near eye and you bounce it off a half silvered lens or something like that, and it's got enough brightness that some goes through the lens or the half silvered mirror and it doesn't matter. And certainly I think there's potential there. The rules are all I'm really trying to say is that the rules are very, very different to making a micro LED display like you see on a video wall, where you've got a cube, something like that, of LEDs like the Samsung wall, and you then have to assemble those at this very small scale where you've got something the size of, say, a fingernail. A lot of things become, the rules change, and you can do quite a lot very with very different constraints.
Because so you don't think that those little micro LEDs with a million nits will be enough to do like a competitor to DLP projector? That's not going to be in the market.
To be honest, I don't know. It's not my field. We haven't looked that much at projection as a threat to direct view displays. You can see, for example, that people are going with laser displays. So I think when we talked at IFA last year, then we saw the first laser displays that they've launched them now in Europe and North America. And the problem with them is always that you can't make black light. So the black level is going to be the color of the screen, the tone of the screen. And to get the whites, then you need a reflective screen. And if that's the case, then the blacks look washed out. So that is always the problem that we have with projection displays. The other one is that you end up, for a big projection display, you end up back in optics. And the one thing that's the problem is that the optics don't cost reduce in the same way that things made on silicon or made on a sheet of glass do. And so, when you look at projection displays today, and especially the short throw projectors, laser projectors, then they're not cheap. They're 80 to 100 inches, but they cost what, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. So that they're hard things to make at a very low cost. People have been having a go with pico projectors, little things sort of size of sort of a car stereo or a packet of cigarettes or something in between, and they've sort of struggled. They've never quite got there to be where the display performance is fully acceptable. They're good in compromises where you've got something, you've got to have the portability, and okay, it's kind of good enough considering the portability. But I think projection continues to struggle because it just can't quite get ever as good as a direct view display.
But it could be argued that some, like historically at least, the film directors, they were designing their movies for be in a cinema, right? So projection. Right. So maybe there's this argument also that maybe actually maybe the black levels or whatever they designed the cinematography is actually maybe a little bit good on projection.
Yeah. If you watch it in the dark, then it's acceptable. And if you see what, for example, can be done in Dolby Cinema, which is just amazing, fantastic experience. I've seen similar ones of 8K projection of live events, and you watch it in the dark, and you're going to a performance, and it's great, really fantastic. I completely lose myself and believe I'm present at a performance and not just viewing a screen. I think what we learned with 3D TV was that watching at home is very different to watching in a cinema, and that when you watch at home, you have lots of distractions, that you sit down in front of it, and then the cat walks past and somebody else walks past and the phone rings, and you stop the movie halfway through to go and get another beer from the fridge, and you have the ambient lighting on a little bit so that people don't fall over furniture, and you get distraction. Whereas in a cinema, ideally you reserve the time for 2-3 hours, whatever, to be not to be disturbed, to give it absolutely all your concentration, and therefore being sat motionless in the dark is just fine, and it's part of the experience. And I think that's a big difference between TV at home and cinema. That cinema, you reserve the time and the space, and that's certainly not the case at home. Clearly, if I had $80,000 and the space to build a dedicated cinema room, I'd have projection, because it's part of that film experience. But for everyday viewing, I have tried it with projection for a few weeks, It's okay, but it doesn't look as good as a direct view screen.
Yeah, it's a different different kind of market, a different people.
Yeah, it's not better or worse; it's different, and that I think is the heart of it. And just to finish the end of my snake, then of course the last one we now hear about is Samsung's next stage in developing technologies, which is QNED. So this is appears to be a gallium nitride based LED display. So it's a fully inorganic one. It looks to be more of a three-dimensional structure, so like the very latest in semiconductor technology. Clearly, we've got even more unknowns than where we are already on that one, and they certainly have that on their roadmap, and we'll see where it goes. And one of the key questions again will be, what's the cost? What's the yield? How reliable is it? And the question there will be, again, what market takes it to maturity? Is there something that it does especially well by comparison with LCD or OLED? So, for example, is it a really robust display with very high brightness that's incredibly durable and temperature resistant, which may make it a very good auto display, for example?
It seems, from what I understand, that Samsung is a very close partner to Nanosys on doing a lot of this stuff, right? Because it looks like the roadmap of Nanosys is basically what Samsung is also kind of doing there. They're like getting on the QDO LED, and then also even they're talking about the next thing, right?
Right. You can see there's clearly some considerable technology partnership on that one, and Samsung's genius is to take very good ideas and promising processes and technologies, and their real skill, which I don't think anybody else comes close, is to take those technologies, recombine them, and then build an entire value chain from scratch, and take all the costs out of it. So each stage may be suboptimal, but it gives you an optimal whole. Whereas in more conventional supply chains, then everybody optimizes the individual bit of it, but nobody looks after the whole. And what we've seen with Samsung time and again is they've been able to build complete supply chains. And when you get these incredibly complicated mixtures of technologies like MicroLED, like QNED, like QD on OLED, then that's where Samsung's real prowess comes to the front, and they can do things that other people really struggle to do.
But actually, the quantum dot LCDs now, it's a lot of different brands, right? Everybody's doing LCDs is kind of doing the quantum dot also, and they're getting quite affordable, right? The good quantum dot performance.
Yeah, that's right. So that in the end is down to Samsung showing people how to make a very efficient value chain for quantum dot films and things like that. Samsung still by far dominates the quantum dot LCD business, so other people have small shares in it. It's rather like their domination of OLED in terms of the OLED display shipped. Then Samsung is by far and away the leader, and still has huge share. So I think for a lot of brands, then on the one hand, Samsung shows how it can be done and what can be done. On the other hand, people fear to go in and join at the same time because it's got Samsung there, and they know that they're going to have a formidable competitor in that market at the same time. So you can see that what's an advantage is potentially also slightly intimidating for entrants. But we've seen TCL and Hisense launch LCD TVs with quantum dot backlights in them. So very definitely two extremely important players in the industry are now present in that.
And has the OLED, the LG OLED business been growing also nicely over this same period recently, and they keep growing? It's
been a tough year for them because of the delays in the Guangzhou fab, where the situation difficulties this year have really made that hard. What we've seen in Q3 this year in TV shipments is that LG display has shifted gear, and suddenly we're back onto that growth track. So clearly there's lots of product coming out of that new fab. And again, suddenly that OLED capacity and OLED TV production, which had plateaued in recent quarters, is suddenly growing again. So I think next year we will see that continue to surge.
And that's because of the Guangzhou, China.
Correct. That's the new
output.
fab.
That's the new LG in China.
That's correct. Yes.
So maybe they have some plans to make it big. They're like,
yeah. Then they've got the next questions. So they got the new fab in Guangzhou, and then potentially to stay in the game and grow, they've got to do a Gen 10 fab or Gen 11. Again, as you say, these are big sums of money that have to be invested, and how much they invest and when they invest it is going to be a big decision. And do they go it alone? Do they have investment partners? How do they finance it? Is going to be a big question. But in the end, it does come down to capacity growth. And Samsung has the same thing. If Samsung's doing QD on OLED, they will have to build new fabs and new equipment, and likewise for QNED. Always there's a capacity game in the background.
And last year you were talking about India, and you were saying that sometimes the consumers in India might not actually have the budget for something that's a little bit above $500 or $1,000 or something like that. But how's it going with the growth in India? Is it still the very low end mostly, or is it like are they able to get really high quality stuff very cheap now?
The tariff structure in India is a problem for anybody. So it does end up as being a difficult market because tariffs are high, and consumers, the spendable incomes are relatively low by comparison with other places. What we have seen is Xiaomi, in particular in India, has been incredibly aggressive with new price points and also at the same time new features. So have really started to increase the level of competition to an extremely high level in India, and that's provoked a backlash, of course, that companies like Samsung and LG and Sony don't just sit there and do nothing. Yeah, they respond. What I think is more interesting in India at the moment is that we do see that it's a market that is so totally different to other ones. So because of hyper competition between mobile providers, then to all intents and purposes, data is free on mobile.
And they got really fast, good internet recently.
Yeah. So people are on 3 and 4G and unlimited data for free. Fill your boots. Free. And so everybody
sponsored by advertising, or what?
yeah, and also sponsored by that investment of blitz scale business models. And however long that investors are prepared to tolerate that kind of business model. As a result, as a crude simplification, then everybody in India has got a smartphone and is streaming video on it. So suddenly the smartphone, which of course is a much more useful device in people's everyday life than a TV, let's be brutal about that. The smartphone has now become the first device that people would want to buy. It's also now the first source of entertainment. And what we're seeing now, that TVs are, if you like, a smartphone docking station. And what we do see in India is that more than half of Indian smartphone users are connecting their phone to a TV every day. Okay, so more than half. So it's a mobile first market. So it's a phone and it's a set-top box in terms of what it does. Yeah.
So they Miracast. They're using Miracast
or they just sideload it via an HDMI socket into the into the USB port, or all kinds of ways of doing it. Yeah. So you cast it. You maybe just tether it, or you maybe just have a smart TV and you use the phone as a modem. So all these things you put together, it's a totally different pattern. We've seen smart TV really surge in India, where companies like Xiaomi can do can engineer the TV and the phone to really work together as a pair, as a tethered system. And as a result, it's a totally different market where the TV is now a smartphone accessory. And it's going to be an interesting one to watch as to whether that breaks out into a consumer behavior in other emerging markets.
You had one of the slides that actually mentioned the manufacturing in India, like there's a little bit happening there, or is part of the tariffs, or is it real manufacturing, or is it more like fake manufacturing where they just assemble parts that ship from China?
It's here. So the Indian government certainly has a plan or a hope that eventually there will be an LCD fab in India. I think the issues that they face are rather like the same issues that you face with the sharp LCD investment in Wisconsin in the United States, which is that all the expertise is in East Asia. The expertise is in Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China. And you therefore will have to ship in a lot of people from those countries to actually work there and provide the expertise until that builds up. And so therefore it's a long game, and whether you can really make it work, or whether you just have a factory full of Chinese expatriates who are on extremely high salaries to make them want to live away from their families and things like that is a big question. And as was discovered in the United States, then it's very, very hard to transplant all that expertise. It's not just the process engineers, it's the suppliers and the complete supply chain of people to support that fab. And if they're all 10,000 kilometers away in another place, it's very difficult to run that standalone. So we still see interest in doing it. We'll see whether it actually happens.
A fab that works good is supposed to, as far as I understand, I've never been able to get close to one, right? But I'm imagining that there's a lot of automation, and so especially the next gen one. So right. I don't really see the point. What do they want to do with like robots to have them in India instead of having them in China? And what does it change? Like it doesn't really help with employment, right? It's just robots.
I think you're right that these in an LCD fab the most impressive thing about an LCD fab is how boring it is. That, a lot of stuff is going on inside tunnels that you can't see because you don't want people in there, and it's all automated. So in terms of direct jobs, it's not like, say, shipbuilding or assembling cars. At the same time, it would certainly catalyze the location of other people in the supply chain to the area. You'd need a glass factory. You would probably aim to have some other bits with it. But you're right that in terms of direct jobs, it doesn't have much effect. It's not a labor-intensive process, and that labor costs are not the most important thing there.
Is Brazil also doing stuff like that with huge tariffs and trying to get stuff done there, or it's not really in the TV?
They certainly talked about it in the past and investigated it in the past. I don't think at the moment it's likely, for exactly the same reasons. That the expertise is elsewhere, and transplanting an entire industrial cluster to a totally new continent is very, very difficult. For the same reason that there's no LCD manufacturing in Europe. At the same time, in Europe, there are specialist companies who make things for LCD manufacturing, being tools and equipment, and of course chemicals and liquid crystal fluid. So people have different parts of the value chain.
One thing that I would like to see in this strange time is many more video conferencing happening on people's TVs. And it would be nice if something more was happening in this area, especially now that I did this video with NVIDIA where they're talking about they can use very little upload bandwidth to get very high quality. Like people could be doing 4K video conferencing with very small internet. And then hopefully there's a market happening with some people doing webcams, especially for the smart TVs.
I think this is a really interesting one that we've we've probably had 5 years of progress this year already. That I think is going to go over to the creatives next, which is that we have potentially a whole new performance medium appearing. That if you want to do concerts or live events, then live streaming to let's just call it remote terminals becomes much more important. I think it's the way that the live performance industry will survive the next 2 years. The technology is there; it needs to be refined, but it's basically there. I think an interesting one like that is that the Royal Opera House in London does a lot of live streaming of its performances, which sounded like a bit of a hobby 2 years ago, although because they were taking public money, they said that it had to be available to, the general taxpayer and not just people living in London, for example. It's a different kind of performance, and it's not better or worse. It's different. So they had it's a lovely story that they had complaints come in for one particular opera where the leading lady had the dry cleaning tag still on the back of her collar. Now, nobody in the opera house could have seen that. Yeah, it's a big stage and it's a long way away, but people watching in 4K could see that because you could have close-ups and things like that, and that means that it's a slightly different performance. But I think it's really interesting, and you're right that let's call it ad hoc, simple, easy to use UHD performances where you get a sense of presence, I think is potentially a new art form. I think it's a new way to transform the economics of live performances, and shouldn't be just all about giant sporting events. And you're right, the things like the cameras are cheap now. With a phone you can do HDR. You can shoot HDR video. It's quite incredible. And get a real sense of presence with it. So why on earth not? Why on earth not?
Nice. So hopefully there's something positive happen out of all this strange situation where I think it's positive if education becomes more video and recorded and on demand and available, and that means customized to every student. And also culture becomes more recorded and like broadcast, and some kind of way to find new artists, not only going to the famous big stadium concerts, but be able to find hopefully there's some they call it build back better.
I think of it rather like a tectonic shift. So the pressure builds up and it slips, and then it goes to a new place, and it then freezes in there for a while until the pressure builds up again. And this year we've definitely seen a big slippage. That all those things about remote working and hey, what can you do with telecoms and the internet and fast connections? Suddenly, we've all been forced to use them, and it's changed. And we'll see where it goes. The one thing to say is that, as always, these things will reflect the fallibility of human beings, and that and it will reflect society, and therefore that things that are inflammatory and induced hate and division will be just as prevalent as they are before. And that's something that's gone on throughout creation of art forms. Everybody was idealistic when radio first appeared, and then it turned into a propaganda tool. We've seen that with sadly with the internet, that it's gone from being benign to being only as good as the people who use it, and it will be the same again.
But hopefully now we can use the internet better. And one thing I wonder also is because it's probably been a fascinating job for those people working at YouTube and Netflix, and those people that optimize the whole backbone of the internet to make sure everybody gets enough bandwidth. I heard, for example, that Greece has some issues with bandwidth. There's too many people watching Netflix and strange websites. So they even ban it during the day because people need to do their work. They need to do
so it's like the water being turned off.
Yeah, but hopefully now everybody builds out fiber everywhere, much faster internet, so everybody can get access to all this stuff. Because on demand is really the best way to consume content, right? Those channels don't really make sense, I think. But
I think it depends. I think for there are also combinations in between. So if you look at the experimentation, for example, being done in Germany by IRT on using 5G networks, where depending on the amount of viewers, you could be operating the system as broadcast, just like conventional TV towers. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, when you've got a channel with only 6 people watching it, then it's more like conventional internet streaming. And that actually could be a very, very good way to reduce the power consumption, energy consumption, and indeed carbon footprint of media and broadcasting. That you switch the way that you send data depending on how many people want to watch it and are watching it at the same time. And that, I think, is a really interesting and disruptive change.
All right. So, and your graphs have a lot of predictions for what's going to happen. So you're quite bullish and positive that 2021, 22, 23 is just going to keep growing.
Yeah.
No matter what happens, no matter what.
This is not just a rosy forecast. So we track all the fab investments that people are putting in. We go and check that, if they've actually dug a hole, if they've actually ordered the equipment. And this is only of investments that, in our view, have a success rate of 30% or more. So there are other ones out there that we don't believe will come to fruition. So yeah, people still want to buy bigger TVs. We haven't yet got to the point where consumers say, no, I'm not going to move any more furniture. That's big enough, and it will come. But so far, the one thing that has consistently surprised us over the last 10 years is that TVs grow by about an inch a year on average in all regions. They start off from different starting points, but that upward trend is still going.
And there's some new consoles, Sony and Microsoft, but I think also the interesting thing, maybe the most interesting thing, is the cloud gaming. And so I think those people would want to play, consumers want to see this on the TV screen. I mean, you can cloud game on your phone, but the TV is really, I see a huge potential. But then if they want this to work, they need to really upgrade low latency networks to everybody, right? Everybody needs to have fiber kind of internet or something that's near fiber and low latency. Yeah,
that's right. It's certainly on the one hand you solve problems, and on the other hand you create a whole load of new ones. And of course, the aim strategically on this is to bring the equivalent of console gaming to emerging markets where consoles aren't affordable. At the same time, in emerging markets, the internet is largely something that's in your pocket rather than comes out of a few wires in the wall or whatever, or a fiber rising up. So it also has to be mobile in terms of the internet connection. So yes, it's a big challenge, and we'll see where it goes. From the console maker's point of view, I can't believe that when they decided on 2020 winter as being the launch date, that they could have anticipated a situation that was quite as benign for gaming. Going back to our initial remarks at the beginning of this call, of that being a couch potato is good. Stay at home, game more. What an amazing place to be as the console makers, and you've just got to try and get the consoles out there now. And of course, they are on. As far as I understand from people who've failed to make orders, then they're certainly they're rationed at the moment. But yeah, what a benign situation for console makers.
I'm not quite sure how they're going to make it work with all the GDPs and all this economy and stuff. If people are being told to go home and play games, it's not going to work. But it seems to be what's happening.
It's an interesting one as to what happens next. I was talking to one of my colleagues today who's he's taking Thursday and Friday off when his console arrives to give it a try. So I said I've got to meet up with him after that, and obviously by by video link to find out what he thinks and is it truly disruptive or not. But yeah, interesting one.
And I'm using this one called Shadow. That's a cloud gaming, but everybody's doing, like Google. I think Apple is just about to do, Amazon, Microsoft. They're all doing this cloud gaming, and it's something that's good to do on a big TV.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, it's always about immersion. And the bigger the screen and the more the resolution, then the more immersion you feel. You know, you've got to make it as realistic as possible. So yeah, definitely, that's going to be the next thing.
And another thing, I hope you don't mind I bring this up, is the MacBook is now with an ARM CPU, right? And why I think this is relevant is that because the ARM CPUs are pretty much kind of could be the same in smart TVs. So in theory, your smart TV should be a full desktop computer. And you should be able to run all your productivity and your video conferencing and anything you want, not just like remote control stuff in the back, but also keyboard and mouse, work.
I think the problem always for the TV is that it's a very long-lived device. So people keep their TVs for 8 years, and that after about 4, the demands of the hardware have moved on, and so people end up buying a stick or something like that to upgrade the TV, and that's the challenge. I think the other one is that interacting with a screen that you can't touch is hard, and what's really succeeded in TVs is long-form video. So that's what people use the apps for. That's what people want to use them for. And sitting back on a couch is not a productivity application. Now that's a separate argument to saying, should people have bigger screens on their desktops? And I keep longing for a 49-inch curved monitor, super wide monitor, because those are great for productivity. And instead, I've got a scattering of monitors on my desk, which I'm trying not to look at the moment. And yeah, I think the argument for a big screen on the desktop is convincing. And if that's your point on TV, then yeah, I agree. Of course, smart TVs have had ARM cores in them for many, many years. And it's been an ARM world. So we will see where it goes, and it is an interesting convergence. Yeah.
So from going down to being couch potatoes, maybe people are going to be productive again with the same machine a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly a 32-inch 4K TV is a fantastic monitor format. Don't think it's a great TV format. You'd have to sit very close to it, but as a desktop thing for a monitor, it's amazing. That you have more pixels than you can possibly see. Everything looks very sharp, and it's very relaxing to look at.
Do you think there's going to be? Do you have some plans? Because there's no CES. What's kind of happening? Are you doing online conferences? Are you doing remote?
Yeah, I'm actually virtually at one these 3 days, which is the 4K Summit, which is normally in Malaga, where you have really the whole UHD industry, especially lots of people from the Spanish-speaking world and Latin America, where there's lots of interesting UHD stuff going on. So I'm kind of virtually speaking at that day after tomorrow, and that's going on at the moment. I'll put a health warning out that my employer is the world's largest organizer of events, but certainly I think the first half of next year I don't see many people organizing in-person conferences. But let's hope that we can all start meeting face to face from the second half of next year. And I think the litmus test is going to be the Olympics. Let's see if the Olympics happens.
All right, and otherwise, let's just do a bunch more of these, if you don't mind.
Okay.
If we get a lot of views, and if you think it's good, we can do it some more.
Always
this could be a conference.
Always a pleasure, Nicola.
All right, thanks a lot for your time.
Okay.
Thanks for giving us an update on the positive stuff happening in the TV business.
Pleasure, Nicola. Okay, thanks then.
Thanks for the time.